His nose is of medium size and has a slight indentation towards the end of the left nostril. His cheeks and temples are flat and hairless. His ears are large and flat. His mouth, of middling size, is absolutely free from bad teeth. His lips, thin and slightly pinched, are covered with a heavy mustache and imperial. His chin is round and also shaded with a many-tinted beard. A small mole ornaments his plump neck in the nape. Finally, when he is in the bath, it can be seen that his skin is white and smooth. His life is calm and regular. Without being robust, thanks to his great temperance, he has kept his health uninjured since his birth. His lungs are rather irritable, and hence he has not contracted the bad habit of smoking. He drinks neither spirits, coffee, liqueurs, nor neat wine. In a word, all that could prejudicially affect his nervous system is vigorously excluded from his table. Light beer and weak wine and water are the only beverages he can take without danger. It is on account of his carefulness that he has never had to consult a doctor since his life began. His gesture is prompt, his walk quick, his character frank and open. His thoughtfulness for others is extreme, and it is on account of this that, in the fear of making his wife unhappy, he has never entered into matrimony. Such would have been the report furnished by Tartlett, but desirable as he might be to a lady of a certain age, the projected union had hitherto failed. The professor remained a bachelor and continued to give lessons in dancing and deportment. It was in this capacity that he entered the mansion of William W. Calderup. As time rolled on, his pupils gradually abandoned him, and he ended by becoming one wheel more in the machinery of the wealthy establishment. After all, he was a brave man, in spite of his eccentricities. Everybody liked him. He liked Godfrey, he liked Fina, and they liked him. He had only one ambition in the world, and that was to teach them all the secrets of his art, to make them, in fact, as far as deportment was concerned, two highly accomplished individuals. Now what would you think? It was he, this Professor Tartlett, whom William W. Calderup had chosen as his nephew's companion during the projected voyage. Yes, he had reason to believe that Tartlett had not a little contributed to imbue Godfrey with this roaming mania, so as to perfect himself by a tour round the world. William W. Calderup had resolved that they should go together. On the morrow, the 16th of April, he sent for the professor to his office. The request of the nabob was an order for Tartlett. The professor left his room with his pocket violin, generally known as a kit, so as to be ready for all emergencies. He mounted the great staircase of the mansion with his feet academically placed, as was fitting for a dancing master, knocked at the door of the room, entered, his body half inclined, his elbows rounded, his mouth on the grin, and waited in the third position after having crossed his feet one before the other, at half their length, his ankles touching and his toes turned out. Anyone but Professor Tartlett placed in this sort of unstable equilibrium would have tottered on his base, but the professor preserved an absolute perpendicularity. "Mr. Tartlett," said William W. Calderup, "I have sent for you to tell you some news which I imagine will rather surprise you." "As you think best," answered the professor. "My nephew's marriage is put off for a year or 18 months, and Godfrey, at his own request, is going to visit the different countries of the Old and New World." "Sir," answered Tartlett, "my pupil Godfrey will do honor to the country of his birth, and to the professor of deportment who has initiated him into etiquette," interrupted the merchant, in a tone of which the guileless Tartlett failed to perceive the irony. And in fact, thinking it the correct thing to execute an assembly, he first moved one foot and then the other, by a sort of semicircular side slide, and then with a light and graceful bend of the knee, he bowed to William W. Calderup. "I thought," continued the latter, "that you might feel a little regret at separating from your pupil." "The regret will be extreme," answered Tartlett, "but should it be necessary?" "It is not necessary," answered William W. Calderup, knitting his bushy eyebrows. "Ah," replied Tartlett. Slightly troubled, he made a graceful movement to the rear, so as to pass from the third to the fourth position, but he left the breadth of a foot between his feet, without perhaps being conscious of what he was doing. Yes, added the merchant in a peremptory tone, which admitted not of the ghost of a reply, I have thought it would really be cruel to separate a professor and a pupil so well made to understand each other. Assuredly, the journey, answered Tartlet, who did not seem to want to understand. Yes, assuredly, replied William W. Colderup. Not only will his travels bring out the talents of my nephew, but the talents of the professor to whom he owes so correct a bearing. Never had the thought occurred to this great baby that one day he would leave San Francisco, California, America, to roam the seas. Such an idea had never entered the brain of a man more absorbed in chorography than geography, and who was still ignorant of the suburbs of the capital beyond 10 miles radius. And now, this was offered to him. He was to understand that nolens volens he was to expatriate himself. He himself was to experience with all their costs and inconveniences the very adventures he had recommended to his pupil. Here, decidedly, was something to trouble a brain much more solid than his, and the unfortunate Tartlet for the first time in his life felt an involuntary yielding in the muscles of his limbs, suppled as they were by 35 years' exercise. Perhaps, said he, trying to recall to his lips the stereotyped smile of the dancer which had left him for an instant, perhaps am I not? You will go, answered William W. Colderup, like a man with whom discussion was useless. To refuse was impossible. Tartlet did not even think of such a thing. What was he in the house? A thing, a parcel, a package to be sent to every corner of the world, but the projected expedition troubled him not a little. And when am I to start? Demanded he, trying to get back into an academical position. In a month. And on what raging ocean has Mr. Colderup decided that his vessel should bear his nephew and me? The Pacific, at first. And on what point of the terrestrial globe shall I first set foot? On the soil of New Zealand, answered William W. Colderup. I have remarked that the New Zealanders always stick their elbows out. Now you can teach them to turn them in. And thus was Professor Tartlet selected as the traveling companion of Godfrey Morgan. A nod from the merchant gave him to understand that the audience had terminated. He retired, considerably agitated, and the performance of the special graces which he usually displayed in this difficult act left a good deal to be desired. In fact, for the first time in his life, Professor Tartlet, forgetting in his preoccupation the most elementary principles of his art, went out with his toes turned in. Chapter 5. In which they prepare to go, and at the end of which they go for good. Before the long voyage together through life, which men call marriage, Godfrey then was to make the tour of the world, a journey sometimes even more dangerous. But he reckoned on returning improved in every respect. He left a lad, he would return a man. He would have seen, noted, compared. His curiosity would be satisfied. There would only remain for him to settle down quietly and live happily at home with his wife, whom no temptation would take him from. Was he wrong or right? Was he to learn a valuable lesson? The future will show. In short, Godfrey was enchanted. Fina, anxious without appearing to be so, was resigned to this apprenticeship. Professor Tartlet, generally so firm on his limbs, had lost all his dancing equilibrium. He had lost all his usual self-possession and tried in vain to recover it. He even tottered on the carpet of his room as if he were already on the floor of a cabin, rolling and pitching on the ocean. As for William W. Colderup, since he had arrived at a decision, he had become very uncommunicative, especially to his nephew. The closed lips and eyes half hidden beneath their lids showed that there was some fixed idea in the head where generally floated the highest commercial speculations. "Ah, you want to travel," muttered he every now and then. "Travel instead of marrying and staying at home. Well, you shall travel." Preparations were immediately begun. In the first place, the itinerary had to be projected, discussed, and settled. Was Godfrey to go south or east or west? that had to be decided in the first place. If he went southwards, the Panama, California, and British Columbia Company, or the Southampton and Rio Janeiro Company would have to take him to Europe. If he went eastwards, the Union Pacific Railway would take him in a few days to New York, and thence the Cunard, Inman, White Star, Hamburg American, or French transatlantic companies would land him on the shores of the Old World. If he went westwards, the Golden Age steam transoceanic would render it easy for him to reach Melbourne, and thence he could get to the Isthmus of Suez by the boats of the Peninsular and Oriental Company. The means of transport were abundant, and thanks to their mathematical agreement, the round of the world was but a simple pleasure tour. But it was not thus that the nephew and heir of the Nabob of Frisco was to travel. No, William W. Calderup possessed for the requirements of his business quite a fleet of steam and sailing vessels. He had decided that one of these ships should be put at the disposal of Godfrey Morgan as if he were a prince of the blood traveling for his pleasure at the expense of his father's subjects. By his orders, the Dream, a substantial steamer of 600 tons and horsepower, was got ready. It was to be commanded by Captain Turcotte, a tough old salt who had already sailed in every latitude in every sea. A thorough sailor, this friend of tornadoes, cyclones, and typhoons, had already spent of his 50 years of life 40 at sea. To bring to in a hurricane was quite child's play to this mariner, who was never disconcerted, except by land sickness when he was in port. His incessantly unsteady existence on a vessel's deck had endowed him with the habit of constantly balancing himself to the right or the left, or behind or in front, as though he had the rolling and pitching variety of St. Vitus's dance. A mate, an engineer, 4 stokers, a dozen seamen, 18 men in all, formed the crew of the Dream, and if the ship was contented to get quietly through 8 miles an hour, she possessed a great many excellent nautical qualities. If she was not swift enough to race the waves when the sea was high, the waves could not race over her, and that was an advantage which quite compensated for the mediocrity of her speed, particularly when there was no hurry. The Dream was brigantine-rigged, and in a favorable wind, with her 400 square yards of canvas, her steaming rate could be considerably increased. It should be borne in mind all through that the voyage of the Dream was carefully planned and would be punctually performed. William W. Calderup was too practical a man not to put to some purpose a journey of 15,000 or 16,000 leagues across all the oceans of the globe. His ship was to go without cargo, undoubtedly, but it was easy to get her down to her right trim by means of water ballast, and even to sink her to her deck, if it proved necessary. The Dream was instructed to communicate with the different branch establishments of the wealthy merchant. She was to go from one market to another. Captain Turcotte, never fear, would not find it difficult to pay the expenses of the voyage. Godfrey Morgan's whim would not cost the avuncular purse a single dollar. That is the way they do business in the best commercial houses. All this was decided at long, very secret interviews between William W. Calderup and Captain Turcotte, but it appeared that the regulation of this matter, simple as it seemed, could not be managed alone, for the captain paid numerous visits to the merchant's office. When he came away, it would be noticed that his face bore a curious expression, that his hair stood on end as if he had been ruffling it up with fevered hands, and that all his body rolled and pitched more than usual. High words were constantly heard, proving that the interviews were stormy. Captain Turcotte, with his plain speaking, knew how to withstand William W. Calderup, who loved and esteemed him enough to permit him to contradict him. And now all was arranged. Who had given in, William W. Calderup or Turcotte, I dare not say, for I do not even know the subject of their discussion. However, I rather think it must have been the captain. Anyhow, after 8 days of interviewing, the merchant and the captain were in accord, but Turcotte did not cease to grumble between his teeth. May 500,000 Davy Joneses drag me to the bottom, if ever I had a job like this before. However, the Dream fitted out rapidly, and her captain neglected nothing which would enable him to put to sea in the first fortnight in June. She had been into dock, and the hull had been gone over with composition, whose brilliant red contrasted vividly with the black of her upper works. A great number of vessels of all kinds and nationalities came into the port of San Francisco. In a good many years, the old quays of the town, built straight along the shore, would have been insufficient for the embarkation and disembarkation of their cargoes, if engineers had not devised subsidiary wharves. Piles of red deal were driven into the water, and many square miles of planks were laid on them and formed huge platforms. A good deal of the bay was thus taken up, but the bay is enormous. There were also regular landing stages, with numberless cranes and crabs, at which steamers from both oceans, steamboats from the Californian rivers, clippers from all countries, and coasters from the American seaboard were ranged in proper order, so as not to interfere one with the other. It was at one of these artificial quays, at the extremity of Mission Wharf Street, that the Dream had been securely moored after she had come out of dock. Nothing was neglected, and the steamer would start under the most favorable conditions. Provisioning, outfit, all were minutely studied. The rigging was perfect, the boilers had been tested, and the screw was an excellent one. A steam launch was even carried to facilitate communication with the shore, and this would probably be of great service during the voyage. Everything was ready on the 10th of June. They had only to put to sea. The men shipped by Captain Turcotte to work the sails or drive the engine were a picked crew, and it would have been difficult to find a better one. Quite a stock of live animals, agoutis, sheep, goats, poultry, and sea were stowed between decks. The material wants of the travelers were likewise provided for by numerous cases of preserved meats of the best brands. The route the Dream was to follow had doubtless been the subject of the long conferences which William W. Colderup had had with his captain. All knew that they were first bound for Auckland, in New Zealand, unless want of coal, necessitated by the persistence of contrary winds, obliged them to refill perhaps at one of the islands of the Pacific or some Chinese port. All this detail mattered little to Godfrey once he was on the sea, and still less to Tartlett, whose troubled spirit exaggerated from day to day the dangers of navigation. There was only one formality to be gone through, the formality of being photographed. An engaged man could not decently start on a long voyage round the world without taking with him the image of her he loved, and in return leaving his own image behind him. Godfrey in tourist costume accordingly handed himself over to Messrs. Stephenson and Co., photographers of Montgomery Street, and Fina, in her walking dress, confided in like manner to the Sun the task of fixing her charming but somewhat sorrowing features on the plate of those able operators. It is also the custom to travel together, and so Fina's portrait had its allotted place in Godfrey's cabin, and Godfrey's portrait its special position in Fina's room. As for Tartlett, who had no betrothed, and who was not thinking of having one at present, he thought it better to confide his image to sensitized paper. But although great was the talent of the photographers, they failed to present him with a satisfactory proof. The negative was a confused fog in which it was impossible to recognize the celebrated professor of dancing and deportment. This was because the patient could not keep himself still, in spite of all that was said about the invariable rule in studios devoted to operations of this nature. They tried other means, even the instantaneous process. Impossible. Tartlett pitched and rolled in anticipation as violently as the captain of the Dream. The idea of obtaining a picture of the features of this remarkable man had thus to be abandoned. Irreparable would be the misfortune if, but far from us, be the thought. If in imagining he was leaving the New World for the Old World, Tartlett had left the New World for the other world from which nobody returns. On the 9th of June, all was ready. The Dream was complete. Her papers, bills of lading, charter party, assurance policy were all in order, and 2 days before the shipbroker had sent on the last signatures. On that day, a grand farewell breakfast was given at the mansion in Montgomery Street. They drank to the happy voyage of Godfrey and his safe return. Godfrey was rather agitated, and he did not strive to hide it. Fina showed herself much the most composed. As for Tartlett, he drowned his apprehensions in several glasses of champagne, whose influence was perceptible up to the moment of departure. He even forgot his kit, which was brought to him as they were casting off the last hawsers of the Dream. The last adieus were said on board, the last handshakings took place on the poop, then the engine gave 2 or 3 turns of the screw, and the steamer was under way. "Goodbye, Fina. Goodbye, Godfrey. May heaven protect you," said the uncle. "And above all, may it bring us back," murmured Professor Tartlett. "And never forget, Godfrey," added William W. Calderup, "the device which the Dream bears on her stern, confide wrecked agents. Never, Uncle Will. Goodbye, Fina. Goodbye, Godfrey." The steamer moved off. Handkerchiefs were shaken as long as she remained in sight from the quay, and even after. Soon the Bay of San Francisco, the largest in the world, was crossed. The Dream passed the narrow throat of the Golden Gate, and then her prow cleft the waters of the Pacific Ocean. It was as though the gates of gold had closed upon her. Chapter 6, in which the reader makes the acquaintance of a new personage. The voyage had begun. There had not been much difficulty so far, it must be admitted. Professor Tartlett, with incontestable logic, often repeated, "Any voyage can begin, but where and how it finishes is the important point." The cabin occupied by Godfrey was below the poop of the Dream and opened on to the dining saloon. Our young traveler was lodged there as comfortably as possible. He had given Fina's photograph the best place on the best lighted panel of his room. A cot to sleep on, a lavatory for toilet purposes, some chests of drawers for his clothes and his linen, a table to work at, an armchair to sit upon. What could a young man in his 22nd year want more? Under such circumstances, he might have gone 22 times round the world. Was he not at the age of that practical philosophy which consists in good health and good humor? Ah, young people, travel if you can, and if you cannot, travel all the same. Tartlett was not in a good humor. His cabin, near that of his pupil, seemed to him too narrow, his bed too hard, the 6 square yards which he occupied quite insufficient for his steps and strides. Would not the traveler in him absorb the professor of dancing and deportment? No, it was in the blood, and when Tartlett reached the hour of his last sleep, his feet would be found placed in a horizontal line, with the heels one against the other, in the first position. Meals were taken in common. Godfrey and Tartlett sat opposite to each other, the captain and mate occupying each end of the rolling table. This alarming appellation, the rolling table, is enough to warn us that the professor's place would too often be vacant. At the start, in the lovely month of June, there was a beautiful breeze from the northeast, and Captain Turcotte was able to set his canvas so as to increase his speed. The Dream, thus balanced, hardly rolled at all, and as the waves followed her, her pitching was but slight. This mode of progressing was not such as to affect the looks of the passengers and give them pinched noses, hollow eyes, livid foreheads, or colorless cheeks. It was supportable. They steered southwest over a splendid sea, hardly lifting in the least, and the American coast soon disappeared below the horizon. For 2 days nothing occurred worthy of mention. The Dream made good progress. The commencement of the voyage promised well, so that Captain Turcotte seemed occasionally to feel an anxiety which he tried in vain to hide. Each day as the sun crossed the meridian, he carefully took his observations. But it could be noticed that immediately afterwards he retired with the mate into his cabin, and then they remained in secret conclave as if they were discussing some grave eventuality. This performance passed probably unnoticed by Godfrey, who understood nothing about the details of navigation. But the boatswain and the crew seemed somewhat astonished at it, particularly as for 2 or 3 times during the first week, when there was not the least necessity for the maneuver, the course of the Dream at night was completely altered and resumed again in the morning. In a sailing ship this might be intelligible, but in a steamer, which could keep on the great circle line and only use canvas when the wind was favorable, it was somewhat extraordinary. During the morning of the 12th of June, a very unexpected incident occurred on board. Captain Turcotte, the mate, and Godfrey were sitting down to breakfast when an unusual noise was heard on deck. Almost immediately afterwards, the boatswain opened the door and appeared on the threshold. "Captain," he said. "What's up?" asked Turcotte, sailor as he was, always on the alert. "Here's a Chinny," said the boatswain. "A Chinese?" "Yes, a genuine Chinese we have just found by chance at the bottom of the hold." "At the bottom of the hold?" exclaimed Turcotte. "Well, by all the somethings of Sacramento, just send him to the bottom of the sea." "All right," answered the boatswain. And that excellent man, with all the contempt of a Californian, for a son of the Celestial Empire, taking the order as quite a natural one, would have had not the slightest compunction in executing it. However, Captain Turcotte rose from his chair, and followed by Godfrey and the mate, left the saloon and walked towards the forecastle of the Dream. There stood a Chinaman, tightly handcuffed, and held by 2 or 3 sailors, who were by no means sparing of their nudges and knocks. He was a man of from 35 to 40, with intelligent features, well-built, of lithe figure, but a little emaciated, owing to his sojourn for 16 hours at the bottom of a badly ventilated hold. Captain Turcotte made a sign to his men to leave the unhappy intruder alone. "Who are you?" he asked. "A son of the sun." "And what is your name?" "Seng Vu," answered the Chinese, whose name in the celestial language signifies, "he who does not live." "And what are you doing on board here?" "I am out for a sail," coolly answered Seng Vu, "but am doing you as little harm as I can." "Really, as little harm? And you stowed yourself away in the hold when we started?" "Just so, Captain." "So that we might take you for nothing from America to China, on the other side of the Pacific." "If you will have it so." "And if I don't wish to have it so, you yellow-skinned nigger, if I will have it that you have to swim to China." "I will try," said the Chinaman with a smile, "but I shall probably sink on the road." "Well, John," exclaimed Captain Turcotte, "I am going to show you how to save your passage money." And Captain Turcotte, much more angry than circumstances necessitated, was perhaps about to put his threat into execution when Godfrey intervened. "Captain," he said, "one more Chinny on board the Dream is one Chinny less in California, where there are too many." "A great deal too many," answered Captain Turcotte. "Yes, too many. Well, if this poor beggar wishes to relieve San Francisco of his presence, he ought to be pitied. Bah, we can throw him on shore at Shanghai, and there needn't be any fuss about it." In saying that there were too many Chinese in California, Godfrey held the same language as every true Californian. The emigration of the sons of the Celestial Empire, there are 300 million in China as against 30 million of Americans in the United States, has become dangerous to the provinces of the far west, and the legislators of these states of California, Lower California, Oregon, Nevada, Utah, and even Congress itself, are much concerned at this new epidemic of invasion, to which the Yankees have given the name of the Yellow Plague. At this period, there were more than 50,000 Chinese in the state of California alone. These people, very industrious at gold washing, very patient, living on a pinch of rice, a mouthful of tea, and a whiff of opium, did an immense deal to bring down the price of manual labor to the detriment of the native workmen. They had to submit to special laws, contrary to the American Constitution, laws which regulated their immigration and withheld from them the right of naturalization, owing to the fear that they would end by obtaining a majority in the Congress. Generally ill-treated, much as Indians or Negroes, so as to justify the title of pests, which was applied to them, they herded together in a sort of ghetto, where they carefully kept up the manners and customs of the Celestial Empire. In the Californian capital, it is in the Sacramento Street District, decked with their banners and lanterns, that this foreign race has taken up its abode. There they can be met in thousands, trotting along in their wide-sleeved blouses, conical hats, and turned-up shoes. Here, for the most part, they live as grocers, gardeners, or laundresses, unless they are working as cooks or belong to one of those dramatic troupes which perform Chinese pieces in the French Theater at San Francisco. And there is no reason why we should conceal the fact. Seng Vu happened to form part of one of these troupes, in which he filled the role of comic lead, if such a description can apply to any Chinese artiste. As a matter of fact, they are so serious, even in their fun, that the Californian romancer, Bret Harte, has told us that he never saw a genuine Chinaman laugh, and has even confessed that he is unable to say whether one of the national pieces he witnessed was a tragedy or a farce. In short, Seng Vu was a comedian. The season had ended, crowned with success, perhaps out of proportion to the gold pieces he had amassed. He wished to return to his country otherwise than as a corpse, for Chinamen always like to get buried at home, and there are special steamers who carry dead celestials and nothing else. At all risks, therefore, he had secretly slipped on board the Dream. Loaded with provisions, did he hope to get through, incognito, a passage of several weeks, and then to land on the coast of China without being seen? It is just possible. At any rate, the case was hardly one for a death penalty. So Godfrey had good reason to interfere in favor of the intruder, and Captain Turcotte, who pretended to be angrier than he really was, gave up the idea of sending Seng Vu overboard to battle with the waves of the Pacific. Seng Vu, however, did not return to his hiding place in the hold, though he was rather an incubus on board. Phlegmatic, methodic, and by no means communicative, he carefully avoided the seamen, who had always some prank to play off on him, and he kept to his own provisions. He was thin enough in all conscience, and his additional weight but imperceptibly added to the cost of navigating the Dream. If Seng Vu got a free passage, it was obvious that his carriage did not cost William W. Colderup very much. His presence on board put into Captain Turcotte's head an idea which his mate probably was the only one to understand thoroughly. He will bother us a bit, this confounded Chinny. After all, so much the worse for him. Whatever made him stow himself away on board the Dream, answered the mate. To get to Shanghai, replied Captain Turcotte, bless John and old John's sons too. Chapter 7, in which it will be seen that William W. Colderup was probably right in insuring his ship. During the following days, the 13th, 14th, and of June, the barometer slowly fell, without an attempt to rise in the slightest degree, and the weather became variable, hovering between rain and wind or storm. The breeze strengthened considerably and changed to southwesterly. It was a headwind for the Dream, and the waves had now increased enormously and lifted her forward. The sails were all furled, and she had to depend on her screw alone, under half steam, however, so as to avoid excessive laboring. Godfrey bore the trial of the ship's motion without even losing his good humor for a moment. Evidently, he was fond of the sea. But Tartlett was not fond of the sea, and it served him out. It was pitiful to see the unfortunate professor of deportment deporting himself no longer, the professor of dancing contrary to every rule of his art. Remain in his cabin, with the seas shaking the ship from stem to stern, he could not. Air, he gasped. And so he never left the deck. A roll sent him rolling from one side to the other, a pitch sent him pitching from one end to the other. He clung to the rails, he clutched the ropes, he assumed every attitude that is absolutely condemned by the principles of the modern choregraphic art. Why could he not raise himself into the air by some balloon-like movement and escape the eccentricities of that moving plane? A dancer of his ancestors had said that he only consented to set foot to the ground so as not to humiliate his companions, but Tartlett would willingly never have come down at all on the deck, whose perpetual agitation threatened to hurl him into the abyss. What an idea it was for the rich William W. Colderup to send him here. "Is this bad weather likely to last?" asked he of Captain Turcotte 20 times a day. "Dunno, barometer is not very promising," was the invariable answer of the captain, knitting his brows. "Shall we soon get there?" "Soon, Mr. Tartlett, soon." "And they call this the Pacific Ocean," repeated the unfortunate man between a couple of shocks and oscillations. It should be stated that not only did Professor Tartlett suffer from seasickness, but also that fear had seized him as he watched the great seething waves breaking into foam level with the bulwarks of the dream, and heard the valves lifted by the violent beats, letting the steam off through the waste pipes, as he felt the steamer tossing like a cork on the mountains of water. "No," said he with a lifeless look at his pupil, "it is not impossible for us to capsize." "Take it quietly, Tartlet," replied Godfrey. "A ship was made to float. There are reasons for all this." "I tell you there are none." And thinking thus, the professor had put on his life belt. He wore it night and day, tightly buckled round his waist. He would not have taken it off for untold gold. Every time the sea gave him a moment's respite, he would replenish it with another puff. In fact, he never blew it out enough to please him. We must make some indulgence for the terrors of Tartlet. To those unaccustomed to the sea, its rolling is of a nature to cause some alarm, and we know that this passenger, in spite of himself, had not even till then risked his safety on the peaceable waters of the Bay of San Francisco, so that we can forgive his being ill on board a ship in a stiffish breeze, and his feeling terrified at the playfulness of the waves. The weather became worse and worse, and threatened the dream with a gale, which, had she been near the shore, would have been announced to her by the semaphores. During the day the ship was dreadfully knocked about, though running at half steam so as not to damage her engines. Her screw was continually emerging in the violent oscillations of her liquid bed. Hence, powerful strokes from its wings in the deeper water, or fearful tremors as it rose and ran wild, causing heavy thunderings beneath the stern, and furious gallopings of the pistons which the engineer could master, but with difficulty. One observation Godfrey made, of which at first he could not discover the cause. This was, that during the night the shocks experienced by the steamer were infinitely less violent than during the day. Was he then to conclude that the wind then fell, and that a calm set in after sundown? This was so remarkable that, on the night between the 21st and of June, he endeavored to find out some explanation of it. The day had been particularly stormy, the wind had freshened, and it did not appear at all likely that the sea would fall at night, lashed so capriciously as it had been for so many hours. Towards midnight, then Godfrey dressed, and wrapping himself up warmly, went on deck. The men on watch were forward. Captain Turcotte was on the bridge. The force of the wind had certainly not diminished. The shock of the waves, which should have dashed on the bows of the Dream, was however very much less violent. But in raising his eyes towards the top of the funnel, with its black canopy of smoke, Godfrey saw that the smoke, instead of floating from the bow aft, was, on the contrary, floating from aft forwards and following the same direction as the ship. "Has the wind changed?" he said to himself. And extremely glad at the circumstance, he mounted the bridge, stepping up to Turcotte. "Captain," he said. The latter, enveloped in his oilskins, had not heard him approach, and at first could not conceal a movement of annoyance in seeing him close to him. "You, Mr. Godfrey, you, on the bridge?" "Yes, Captain, I came to ask." "What?" answered Captain Turcotte sharply. "If the wind has not changed." "No, Mr. Godfrey, no, and unfortunately I think it will turn to a storm." "But we now have the wind behind us." "Wind behind us, yes, wind behind us," replied the captain, visibly disconcerted at the observation, "but it is not my fault." "What do you mean?" "I mean that in order not to endanger the vessel's safety, I have had to put her about and run before the storm." "That will cause us a most lamentable delay," said Godfrey. "Very much so," answered Captain Turcotte, "but when day breaks, if the sea falls a little, I shall resume our westerly route. I should recommend you, Mr. Godfrey, to get back to your cabin. Take my advice, try and sleep while we are running before the wind. You will be less knocked about." Godfrey made a sign of affirmation, turning a last anxious glance at the low clouds which were chasing each other with extreme swiftness. He left the bridge, returned to his cabin, and soon resumed his interrupted slumbers. The next morning, the 22nd of June, as Captain Turcotte had said, the wind having sensibly abated, the Dream was headed in proper direction. This navigation towards the west during the day, towards the east during the night, lasted for 48 hours more, but the barometer showed some tendency to rise. Its oscillations became less frequent. It was to be presumed that the bad weather would end in northerly winds. And so, in fact, it happened. On the 25th of June, about 8 o'clock in the morning, when Godfrey stepped on deck, a charming breeze from the northeast had swept away the clouds. The sun's rays were shining through the rigging and tipping its projecting points with touches of fire. The sea, deep green in color, glittered along a large section of its surface beneath the direct influence of its beams. The wind blew only in feeble gusts, which laced the wave crests with delicate foam. The lower sails were set. Properly speaking, they were not regular waves on which the sea rose and fell, but only lengthened undulations which gently rocked the steamer. Undulations or waves, it is true, it was all one to Professor Tartlett, as unwell when it was too mild as when it was too rough. There he was, half crouching on the deck, with his mouth open like a carp fainted out of water. The mate on the poop, his telescope at his eye, was looking towards the northeast. Godfrey approached him. "Well, sir," said he gaily, "today is a little better than yesterday." "Yes, Mr. Godfrey," replied the mate, "we are now in smooth water." "And the Dream is on the right road?" "Not yet." "Not yet, and why?" "Because we have evidently drifted northeastwards during this last spell, and we must find out our position exactly. But there is a good sun and a horizon perfectly clear. At noon, in taking its height, we shall get a good observation, and then the captain will give us our course." "Where is the captain?" asked Godfrey. "He has gone off." "Gone off?" "Yes, our lookouts saw from the whiteness of the sea that there were some breakers away to the east, breakers which are not shown on the chart. So the steam launch was got out, and with the boatswain and 3 men, Captain Turcotte has gone off to explore." "How long ago?" "About an hour and a half." "Ah," said Godfrey, "I am sorry he did not tell me. I should like to have gone too." "You were asleep, Mr. Godfrey," replied the mate, "and the captain did not like to wake you." "I am sorry, but tell me, which way did the launch go?" "Over there," answered the mate, "over the starboard bow northeastwards." "And can you see it with the telescope?" "No, she is too far off." "But will she be long before she comes back?" "She won't be long, for the captain is going to take the sights himself, and to do that he must be back before noon." At this Godfrey went and sat on the forecastle, having sent someone for his glasses. He was anxious to watch the return of the launch. Captain Turcotte's reconnaissance did not cause him any surprise. It was natural that the Dream should not be run into danger on a part of the sea where breakers had been reported. 2 hours passed. It was not until 10:30 that a light line of smoke began to rise on the horizon. It was evidently the steam launch which, having finished the reconnaissance, was making for the ship. It amused Godfrey to follow her in the field of his glasses. He saw her little by little reveal herself in clearer outline. He saw her grow on the surface of the sea and then give definite shape to her smoke wreath, as it mingled with a few curls of steam on the clear depth of the horizon. She was an excellent little vessel, of immense speed, and as she came along at full steam, she was soon visible to the naked eye. Towards 11 o'clock, the wash from her bow as she tore through the waves was perfectly distinct, and behind her the long furrow of foam gradually growing wider and fainter like the tail of a comet. At 11:15, Captain Turcotte hailed and boarded the Dream. "Well, Captain, what news?" asked Godfrey, shaking his hand. "Ah, good morning, Mr. Godfrey." "And the breakers?" "Only show," answered Captain Turcotte. "We saw nothing suspicious. Our men must have been deceived, but I am rather surprised at that, all the same." "We are going ahead then," said Godfrey. "Yes, we are going on now, but I must first take an observation." "Shall we get the launch on board?" asked the mate. No, answered the captain, we may want it again. Leave it in tow. The captain's orders were executed, and the launch, still under steam, dropped round to the stern of the Dream.